Tom had been driving trucks for over 15 years. He loved the open road, the quiet nights, and the time alone in his cab, with only the radio to keep him company. Being a long-haul trucker wasn't easy, but he was used to it. He liked the freedom it gave him, just him, his rig, and the miles stretching out before him. One evening, he got a call from his dispatcher about a delivery that needed to be made overnight. The route was out on a lonely highway, far from any major cities, and the deadline was tight. Tom didn't mind. He had driven every kind of road, in all kinds of weather, and through the most remote places. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. So when he accepted the job, he didn't think twice about it. He started the trip late in the evening, just as the sun was setting. The sky turned a deep orange, fading into darkness as he left the city behind. The road ahead was empty. It was a stretch of Route 66 that most people didn't use anymore, except for truckers like him who needed to get somewhere fast. Towns were few and far between, and even gas stations were hard to come by. But Tom was prepared. He had filled up his tank, stocked his cab with snacks, and made sure his radio was tuned to his favorite station. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. The highway stretched on for miles, the landscape flat and barren on either side. Tom listened to the hum of his engine and the low static of the radio as he passed the time. Occasionally, he would see a sign for a rest stop or an old diner that had long been abandoned. But there were no other cars, no lights, just the endless road ahead. Around 10 p.m., Tom noticed a change in the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog began to creep in. It started slowly at first, just a mist hanging over the road, but soon it grew thicker, swirling around his truck, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of him. Tom slowed down, squinting through the fog, trying to stay on the road. As he drove deeper into the fog, something strange happened. His CB radio crackled to life, and a voice came through. "Hey trucker," the voice said low and gravelly. "You out there on Route 66? Tom frowned, glancing at the radio. He hadn't seen another car in hours, and the highway had been deserted. "Yeah, who's this?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Just another driver," the voice replied. "I'm warning you, you don't want to be out here at midnight." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "Thanks for the warning, but I'll be fine," he said, his tone light. He wasn't easily rattled, and ghost stories weren't something he believed in. He turned the volume down on the radio, thinking it was probably just another trucker messing around. But the voice didn't stop. "You should turn back now while you still can," it said. "You don't want to end up like the others." A chill ran down Tom's spine, but he tried to shrug it off. He didn't believe in superstitions or strange tales. He'd been on this road plenty of times, and nothing had ever happened. He kept driving, but the fog was getting thicker, almost unnatural. It clung to the sides of his truck, wrapping around it like a blanket, making it impossible to see the road ahead. As midnight approached, Tom felt a growing sense of unease. He checked the dashboard clock, 11:50 p.m. Something about the warning from the radio was bothering him, but he didn't want to admit it. He was too proud to let a silly radio message get to him. He focused on the road, but the fog made everything feel off. The headlights barely pierced through the gray, and the road itself seemed to stretch on forever. At 11:59 p.m., Tom's truck suddenly shuddered, like it had hit something. The steering wheel jerked in his hands, and he struggled to keep control. His heart raced as he quickly pulled over to the side of the road, the fog swirling around him. Grabbing his flashlight, he climbed out of the cab, the cold night air hitting his face. He walked around the truck, shining the light on the ground, expecting to see some kind of animal or debris. But there was nothing. The road was completely empty, no animal, no object, no sign of what he might have hit. Tom frowned, feeling the unease grow in his stomach. He checked the tires, the undercarriage, but everything looked fine. As he stood there in the fog, he realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. There were no sounds, no crickets, no wind, not even the distant hum of another vehicle. Just silence. Feeling a chill creep up his spine, Tom hurried back to the cab. As he climbed inside, he noticed something strange. The clock on the dashboard was stuck at 11:59 p.m. No matter how long he waited, the time didn't change. He tapped the clock, thinking it must be a glitch, but it didn't move. Confused, he tried starting the truck again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It sputtered once, twice, then fell silent. Tom's frustration turned to anxiety. He reached for the radio, intending to call for help, but before he could speak, the radio crackled to life again. "I warned you," the voice said, quieter this time, almost a whisper. Tom froze, his hand hovering over the radio. His mouth went dry as he scanned the fog outside, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice shaky. The radio remained silent, the only sound the soft static humming in the background. Tom's breathing grew heavy as he stared out into the fog, trying to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't the kind to scare easily, but something about this night felt wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut, a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A shadow moving through the fog, slowly, steadily, coming toward him. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, thinking it might be his imagination, but the shadow was still there, growing larger, more defined. It was a figure, a person, walking down the middle of the road, heading straight for his truck. Tom's hands shook as he fumbled to lock the doors. His heart was racing, his mind screaming at him to drive, to get out of there. But the truck wouldn't start, and the figure kept coming closer. Through the fog, Tom could see that the figure was wearing some kind of old-fashioned clothing, a long coat that billowed in the mist. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Tom could feel its eyes on him, watching him, waiting. Panicking, Tom tried the ignition again, his hands trembling as he twisted the key. The engine sputtered, but it wouldn't start. The figure was only a few feet away now, just outside the driver's side window. Tom slammed his hand on the steering wheel in frustration, his eyes wide with terror. The fog was so thick, he could barely see anything anymore, just the vague outline of the figure standing next to his truck. Then, slowly, the figure raised its hand and knocked on the window. Tom jumped, his heart nearly stopping. He pressed himself against the seat, his mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. The knock came again, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was outside had all the time in the world. With shaking hands, Tom reached for the door handle, but stopped himself. His instincts screamed at him not to open the door, not to let whatever was out there in. He stayed still, holding his breath, hoping that if he didn't move, the figure would go away. But then, the figure's face appeared in the window, pale, expressionless, with hollow black eyes that seemed to look right through him. Tom felt a scream rise in his throat, but no sound came out. He was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, as the figure stared at him. The figure's mouth opened, and Tom heard the same voice from the radio, whispering, "You should have listened." Tom's vision blurred as his heart pounded in his chest. He felt a cold, suffocating terror wash over him, and before he knew it, everything went black. The next morning, Tom's truck was found on the side of the road, abandoned. There was no sign of Tom anywhere. The truck was in perfect condition, except for one strange detail. The clock on the dashboard was still stuck at 11:59 p.m. Weeks passed, and Tom was never found. Other truckers who knew him started telling stories about the strange disappearance. Some said he had driven into a bad part of the country, a place where time didn't work the way it should. Others whispered about old legends, about spirits that haunted the lonely highways, taking those who didn't heed the warnings. But no one knew for sure. All they knew was that Route 66 wasn't the same anymore. The road had become a place of fear, a place where truckers refused to drive at night. Some said they heard voices on their radios, warning them to turn back. Others claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving through the fog, watching, waiting. And every once in a while, someone would report seeing an old truck on the side of the road, with its lights off and its engine cold. Inside, the dashboard clock was always stuck at 11:59. Those who passed by knew better than to stop, because once the clock reached midnight, there was no coming back. Tom was a seasoned truck driver, the kind of man who had spent more nights behind the wheel than he cared to count. He had been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, crossing the country from coast to coast, watching endless roads disappear under the tires of his 18-wheeler. He knew every trick of the trade, every shortcut, every diner where the coffee was still hot in the middle of the night. He liked the solitude that came with the job, the quiet hum of the engine, and the occasional company of his favorite radio shows. Tom was used to long stretches of dark highways, the empty landscapes that stretched out under the stars, far from any town or city. One night, Tom received a late call from his dispatcher about an urgent delivery. It was a last-minute job, something about a shipment that needed to be delivered to a remote town by morning. The route took him down a lonely highway he wasn't familiar with, but Tom had never been one to back down from a job. He agreed to take it, figuring it was just another night on the road, like so many others. The sun had already set by the time Tom left the truck stop, and the darkness settled in fast. The route led him away from the main highways, down smaller, less traveled roads that wound through forests and open plains. He didn't mind the isolation. In fact, he found it peaceful. The radio crackled with static, and he fiddled with the dial, trying to find a station. After a few tries, he gave up and let the static hum in the background. The night was unusually dark, the sky covered in thick clouds that blocked out the stars. Tom's headlights cut through the darkness, but the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The farther he drove, the more deserted the road became. He hadn't seen another car for hours, and the small towns he passed through were little more than ghostly clusters of buildings, their windows dark, their streets empty. Tom felt the first twinge of unease when he realized he had lost track of time. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was past midnight, but the road ahead still seemed to go on forever. He should have been closer to his destination by now. He pulled out the small map his dispatcher had given him, but the road didn't match up with anything he saw on the map. Frowning, he figured he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, but he hadn't seen any turnoffs for miles. As he pondered his next move, the CB radio crackled to life. The sudden noise startled him. He hadn't heard a thing on the radio all night, and now a voice was coming through, distorted but clear enough to understand. "Driver, you out there?" the voice said. It was a man's voice, calm but with a strange echo to it. Tom picked up the receiver, unsure of who was calling. "Yeah, I'm out here," he replied. "Who's this?" There was a long pause on the other end before the voice came back, quieter this time. "You're on the wrong road, driver. You need to turn back." Tom frowned, glancing at the empty road ahead. "What do you mean, wrong road? I'm following the map." Another pause, and then the voice came back, more urgent now. "You don't understand. This road doesn't go where you think it does. Turn around before it's too late." A chill ran down Tom's spine. The voice sounded serious, but he wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or pranks. "Who is this? Are you messing with me?" The radio went silent for a moment, and then the voice said, "You've been warned." And just like that, the radio cut off, leaving only static. Tom stared at the receiver in his hand, wondering if it was some kind of joke. Maybe another trucker was bored and trying to scare him, but there was something about the way the voice had spoken, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Shaking off the feeling, Tom decided to keep going. He couldn't afford to waste time. He had a delivery to make, and he wasn't about to let some weird prank throw him off. The road stretched on, and the fog began to roll in. At first, it was just a light mist hanging in the air, but soon it thickened, swirling around the truck like a heavy blanket. Tom slowed down, squinting through the windshield, but visibility was getting worse by the minute. The fog was strange, almost unnatural. It didn't drift the way fog normally did. Instead, it seemed to cling to the road, thickening in places and thinning in others, like it was alive. Tom's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. He had driven through fog before, but nothing like this. It made the road ahead look distorted, as if the landscape was shifting under the fog's cover. He glanced at the clock again. The numbers hadn't moved in what felt like hours. It was still stuck at 12:15, and no matter how much time passed, the hands didn't budge. Tom cursed under his breath, wondering if the clock had broken, but everything else on the dashboard seemed to be working fine. He tried to shake off the growing unease, focusing on the road ahead. Suddenly, something appeared in the distance. At first, Tom thought it was another vehicle, but as he got closer, he realized it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. He hit the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just in time. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in what looked like old tattered clothes, standing there as if he had been waiting for Tom to stop. Tom's heart raced as he honked the horn, but the man didn't budge. His face was hidden in the shadows, but something about his posture made Tom's stomach churn. It didn't feel right. The man just stood there, motionless, as if he were a statue carved out of the night itself. "Get out of the road," Tom yelled, leaning out the window, but the figure remained still. The fog swirled thicker around the truck, and the man disappeared into the mist as quickly as he had appeared. Tom blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Had it been real? Was it just the fog playing tricks on his eyes? He slammed the truck back into gear and continued driving, his pulse pounding in his ears. Something about this road was all wrong, but he didn't know what. He tried to stay calm, telling himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. The fog grew even thicker, to the point where Tom could barely see the road in front of him. His headlights seemed to be swallowed up by the mist, and he had to slow down to a crawl. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. Every so often, he thought he saw movement in the fog. Shadows shifting just out of sight, figures walking alongside the road, but every time he looked, there was nothing there. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift. The air cleared, and Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The road was visible again, stretching out ahead of him, and for a moment, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. But that relief was short-lived. As he drove on, Tom noticed something odd. The road looked different now, unfamiliar in a way that made his stomach twist with unease. The trees lining the road were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sky above was an unnatural shade of black, darker than any night Tom had ever seen. He glanced at the clock again. It still hadn't moved. 12:15. No matter how long he drove, the time remained the same. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life again. "I told you to turn back," the voice said. It was the same voice from before, but now it sounded distant, hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded, gripping the receiver tightly. "What do you want?" "You're on the wrong road," the voice repeated. "There's no going back now." Before Tom could respond, the radio went silent, the static fading into nothingness. He slammed the receiver down, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. This wasn't just some prank. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain. The road stretched on, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Tom had been driving for hours, but he still hadn't seen any sign of a town. No lights, no buildings, just the endless road and the strange, twisted trees that lined it. And then, up ahead, Tom saw something that made his blood run cold. It was another truck, identical to his own, parked on the side of the road. The headlights were off, and the cab was dark. Tom slowed down as he passed it, glancing out the window. What he saw made his heart stop. Sitting in the driver's seat of the truck was a man. No, it was him. Tom stared at his own reflection, sitting in the cab of the other truck, eyes wide with terror, hands gripping the steering wheel. He slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a stop. He looked back, but the other truck was gone, vanished into thin air. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. Was he losing his mind? Was it the fog playing tricks on him? But deep down, Tom knew the truth. This road wasn't real. It wasn't a road anyone was supposed to be on. The CB radio crackled to life one last time, and the voice whispered, "You should have turned back when you had the chance." Tom's hands trembled as he stared down the endless road ahead, knowing there was no turning back now. Tom had been driving trucks for over 15 years, and he knew the roads better than most. He had been everywhere, across state lines, through small towns, and down highways that felt like they stretched forever. It was a lonely life being a trucker, but Tom liked the solitude. It was peaceful in a way, just him, his rig, and the road ahead. The miles rolled by, and the hum of the engine became a kind of comfort. One evening, Tom was on his way to a small town he'd never heard of. The dispatcher had called him earlier that day with a rush delivery. It wasn't unusual for Tom to get last-minute jobs, and he didn't mind. It meant more money in his pocket and more time on the road. The only thing that struck him as odd was that the dispatcher didn't seem to know much about the delivery. "Just take it to the address I gave you," she said. "It's a bit out of the way, but you shouldn't have any trouble." Tom set out in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. He had a long drive ahead, but he wasn't worried. The road was clear, and his truck was running smoothly. He settled into his seat, sipping coffee from a thermos and listening to the radio. The familiar sounds of country music and static filled the cab as he drove further away from the city and deeper into the countryside. As night fell, the road became darker and more isolated. There were fewer cars now, and the towns he passed through seemed almost deserted. The streetlights were dim, and many of the buildings were dark, their windows covered in dust. Tom figured it was just one of those forgotten places, the kind that people moved away from when the jobs dried up. He had seen plenty of towns like this in his time on the road. The highway stretched out before him, long and empty. Tom glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearing midnight, and he still had a couple of hours to go before he reached his destination. He yawned, his eyes heavy from the long day, but he wasn't too tired to keep going. A few more hours, and he'd be done. The radio started to crackle with static. Tom fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear station, but all he got was more static. He frowned, giving the dial another twist, but the noise didn't stop. He switched off the radio, preferring the silence to the irritating hiss of static. He continued driving, but something was bothering him. The road ahead seemed different. It wasn't the smooth, familiar pavement he was used to. The road seemed older, more worn down, with cracks snaking across the surface. The trees that lined the highway looked twisted, their branches gnarled and bare. Tom shook his head, telling himself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on him. The truck's headlights illuminated the stretch of road in front of him, but the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. The farther he drove, the more isolated he felt. The landscape around him seemed to shift, becoming more eerie with each passing mile. Tom's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he felt a strange unease settle over him. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he drove, Tom noticed a figure standing on the side of the road up ahead. At first, he thought it might be a hitchhiker, but something about the figure made him uneasy. The person was standing still, their back to the road, not moving an inch. Tom slowed the truck as he approached, trying to get a better look. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. Their hair was long and matted, hanging down over their face. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. There was something off about the way the person was just standing there, like they didn't belong. He considered stopping to see if they needed help, but something in his gut told him to keep going. He pressed his foot down on the gas and drove past the figure, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. As the truck sped by, the figure turned slowly to face him. Tom's heart skipped a beat. The person's face was pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes were wide, staring straight at him. But it was the smile that sent a wave of fear through him, a wide, unnatural grin that seemed too big for their face. Tom's hands tightened on the wheel, and he accelerated, putting distance between himself and the figure. His heart was racing now, and his mind was trying to make sense of what he had just seen. It had to be his imagination. He was tired, and the long hours on the road were getting to him. That was all. But as he continued down the road, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The air around him felt heavier, colder. Tom glanced at the dashboard again. The clock hadn't moved. It still showed the same time, 11:45. He tapped the glass, wondering if it had broken, but nothing changed. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. The trees on either side loomed closer, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. Tom's breath came in shallow bursts as the feeling of dread tightened in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew he needed to get off this road. Just as he was about to turn the truck around, the headlights caught something in the distance. Another figure, standing in the middle of the road. This one was closer, and Tom could see it more clearly. It was a woman, dressed in a long white dress that billowed in the wind. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging down over her face. Tom's stomach dropped. There was no way she could have gotten here. He had driven miles since he passed the first figure. It didn't make any sense. He slowed the truck, unsure of what to do. The woman didn't move, just stood there, staring at him with those same wide, unblinking eyes. Tom's pulse quickened. He couldn't go around her, and stopping didn't feel like an option. The air inside the cab felt suffocating, and his mind was racing. He couldn't explain it, but every instinct in his body was screaming at him to get away. Without thinking, Tom swerved the truck to the side of the road, narrowly missing the figure. The truck's tires screeched as they skidded on the gravel, and Tom fought to keep control. When he finally came to a stop, he looked back at the road, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. Tom's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. He was breathing hard, trying to calm himself down, but the fear wouldn't go away. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to get off this road. He shifted the truck into gear and started driving again, this time faster. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He just needed to get away from whatever this was. The trees seemed to close in around him as he sped down the road, the darkness pressing in from all sides. As he drove, the radio crackled to life again. Tom flinched, his heart jumping in his chest. The static was louder now, more aggressive, like something was trying to break through. He reached for the dial, but before he could turn it off, a voice came through. "Tom," the voice whispered. Tom's blood ran cold. The voice was soft, almost like a child's, but there was something wrong with it. It was distorted, echoing in a way that made it sound inhuman. "Tom," the voice said again, a little louder this time. Tom's hand froze over the dial. His heart was racing, his breath coming in short gasps. He didn't know how the voice knew his name, but it wasn't something he wanted to find out. "You shouldn't have come here, Tom," the voice continued, its tone almost mocking. "You don't belong on this road." Tom's chest tightened. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles white. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice shaking with fear. The radio crackled again, and the voice replied, "You'll see." Tom's hands trembled as he turned the radio off, the voice disappearing into the static. He was sweating now, the fear gnawing at him from the inside. The road stretched on, endless and empty, and he had no idea where it would lead him. Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered. Tom's eyes widened in panic as the truck started to slow down. He pressed down on the gas, but the engine only coughed and sputtered more. The truck was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truck came to a stop in the middle of the road. Tom sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, his mind racing. He tried the ignition again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The only sound was the eerie silence of the night. Tom looked around, hoping to see some sign of life, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees silent and still. He was completely alone, or so he thought. Out of the corner of his eye, Tom saw movement. His heart pounded as he turned to look, his breath catching in his throat. Standing by the side of the road was the figure again, the woman in white. She was closer now, her face visible in the dim light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and dark, staring directly.